Good evening. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be back here at Wheaton College. I am always honored to get some time with Vincent and just to talk about all of the things we text about throughout the entire year. And it's always a privilege to meet with students and people that are a part of the college community to hear how you're processing politics and policy in the world and the spaces where you do life. I love being outside of the bubble of the Beltway. I was in Florida a couple of days ago. We'll be in Boston tomorrow. I was in Phoenix last week. And so I just think it's very important that we connect deeply with the people who are reading the work we are writing and the people that we are writing about. And so I'm here primarily, as far as my talk piece, to just talk a bit about how identity politics influenced the 2018 election, or perhaps shaped it. And then the Q&A is pretty much a free-for-all as far as answering your questions that don't have to be directly related to what it is that I'm speaking about. But just to give you a bit of a background, I throw out the term identity politics as if everyone knows what it is, and I cannot make that assumption. Because I know it's a new term to some people. It's also a term that's been weaponized by other people. And so depending on the perspective from which you come to this conversation, we may be talking about different things. So I write about identity politics for the Washington Post for a blog called The Fix. It's a political analysis blog. I'm a political analysis writer. I'm not a direct reporter. I'm not an opinion writer. I write somewhere in between that. It's very difficult finding that in-between space. Depending on how you feel about the piece, you may think I crossed the line or I didn't cross the line as much. That's a perspective that you are free to have. I probably disagree, but I very well may agree in many times. And so what a direct reporter does, which is what I've spent most of my career doing, is just telling you what happened. Subject, verb, did this. An opinion writer would say, subject, verb, did this, and it is good or bad, or it's right or wrong. Analysis, I write about what it means. This is what happens. This is the impact that it could possibly have. And I think that's important because I think a lot of times decisions are made and we may not know what the implications of those decisions will be. How do I know what will happen? Well, sometimes I do not. But generally speaking, I have a good idea based on interviewing I've done, speaking with experts, looking at data and stats, and quite frankly, having about 20 years in journalism covering politics. To give you a bit of background, I was born in Washington, D.C., in a very political family. My mom was chief of staff for a congressman for 20 years. Her grandfather was in the state legislature. I was talking to Vincent about this earlier. It's funny sometimes when I think about how political my family is. My dad worked in the U.S. Capitol. My sister is an accountant for the FBI. my older brother worked in IT in Congress, and so it was just pretty normal to be in politics. But I don't know how exceptional that is. As you probably know, DC is a one-industry town. So most people work in government or politics on some level. But that was my norm, running around the Capitol as a kid and coming home and having conversations about how policy directly impact the lives of people who are led by our politicians. But another thing you may or may not know about Washington, D.C., and this gives you a better idea of how I got into journalism and perhaps identity politics specifically. Washington, D.C. has one of the highest percentages of college-educated black people. And as I said, well, I didn't say, but my mom went to grad school, her parents went to graduate school. And when I looked at the news, I did not see people from my world reflected in the media. And I did not think that it was ill intent. I just thought, whoa, I guess they don't know my parents or my doctor who is black or my dentist who is black or our family lawyer who is black, or not even from a class standpoint, or my barber who's black or the bus driver who's black. Not everyone who is black is either an athlete or a criminal. But if you look at the media, that's what you would be led to believe. And so, I would look at the news and I was like, oh, I'll just go into journalism and tell the stories of the people I do life with. And so my first journalism job was my senior year in high school. I worked at BET News. There was a show at that time called Teen Summit, which was the precursor to 106 in Park. Teen Summit's responsibility was to tell the stories that are shaping the lives of young black people in America. And so I did that and enjoyed it and loved it, and went to study journalism at the University of North Carolina. I wanted to be a broadcast journalist based on my time at Teen Summit. I hated studying broadcast journalism. It was very difficult for me. One of the things I loved about being at Teen Summit is when you're 18 working for a major cable network and you're talent, they don't let you touch any of the equipment. It's worth more than you are. When you go to college to study broadcast journalism, they want you to do your own editing and your lighting and your shooting and all the tech stuff that you would be appearing on. I have very poor tech skills. I do not have a TV at home. I am on CNN or MSNBC every day and I don't have a TV. I don't know how to work remote controls or Alexa. It's really bad. And so I could learn, or I could say I'm gonna work on being better in other things. And that's what I've chosen to do. And so when I realized how much I didn't enjoy broadcast journalism, I had my first quarter-life crisis because it was the end of junior year. If you're like 21 and having one, there'll be some more. It was the end of my junior year, and I knew that I didn't want to be on local news, but I wanted to graduate. And so I did what many people do, and I went to Africa for a semester. And I was in an honor study abroad program there that had an internship component. And the director of my study abroad program said, "You are going to work at a newspaper." And I said, "No, I'm not doing journalism. I'm here to find myself like everybody else in Africa." He said, "No, you're going to do it." And I did it, and I loved it. I loved writing. And I realized that what I wanted to do was tell stories. That's all I ever wanted to do. I didn't want to worry about the visuals. And it was an incredibly pleasurable experience for me. And so I came back to the States for my final semester and decided to write for the student newspaper for my final semester. And after I graduated, I went to go be a journalist in Charlotte, North Carolina. And after that, I was a journalist for a couple of years in Kansas City, which I really loved. And then after that, I was a journalist in Phoenix. And it was a pleasurable experience. I learned so much. Charlotte, Kansas City, Phoenix, very different cities, very different from Washington, D.C., and very helpful in learning about the world outside of my world. And I thought I'd do it for about 5 years tops. I did it for maybe 13 years. And I thought I'd do it for 5 years because I hadn't known any young journalists who had been journalists more than 5 years. And there are lots of reasons for that I could talk about if you're interested in the industry. But my last stop in Phoenix was covering urban policy. I was writing about the revitalization and even gentrification of Phoenix. If you've paid attention to New York City or San Francisco, you see that these cities are changing and becoming increasingly inaccessible for the people who have been there for decades. But if you've been paying attention to urban issues across the world, it's not just New York City and San Francisco that are changing. Nashville's changing, Denver's changing, Dallas is changing. And so I wanted to stop writing about how cities were changing and be involved in helping cities change well, because there has to be a way to make cities cooler and nicer without pushing out all of the poor people of color. And so I said, I will leave Phoenix, which I loved. I loved my work and my church and my friends, only if I get into a really good school. And so I got into Harvard. And I went there and studied public policy with the goal of, finishing there and going to a think tank or a foundation and working on making cities better. And I loved it. It was an amazing time. There were so many smart people, and it was so cold and so expensive. And I realized there that the best place for someone like me to be involved in the policy-making conversation, honestly, was in the mainstream media. Think tanks produce awesome papers read primarily only by really smart, wonky people. And the solutions to many foundations and think tanks arrive at are definitely shaped by the dollars that come to them by their donors. And so that wasn't really attractive to me. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to write work that was read by PhDs and my cousins at the barbershop who did not go to college because policy affects all of these people. And so one of the reasons I went to Harvard, besides it being Harvard, is it actually was one of the few schools that had a great relationship between journalism and public policy. And so I met a lot of awesome journalists while I was there, including some from CNN. And so I actually was approached with a job opportunity from CNN and decided to go there right after graduation. So my first day at CNN was the day that Donald Trump announced he wanted to be president. And so I covered that on the first day before I knew where the bathrooms even were. My second day at CNN was the day of the Charleston massacre, where a white supremacist entered a church during a prayer meeting. So it was a hard week. And I was talking to some student journalists earlier about how in my job, where I do so much stuff I love, you can become very hardened about what it is you do, or you can remember that you're writing about people and human beings. But you have to work to remember the latter. And you have to have people around you who help you remember what it is that you're doing. And so I have probably spent I started therapy in July, and I left CNN more than a year ago, and I'm processing how traumatic it is to wake up and write about police officers killing young black men, or babies being put in cages because they are immigrants, or refugees drowning in their quest to go to a country that allows them to express their deeply held convictions. And it can be very, very difficult. It can be very, very difficult. But it's deeply rewarding, and I'm humbled and grateful to be able to do the work. And I enjoyed my time at CNN. And if you remember the 2016 election, which may seem like a lifetime ago, people were engaging media at levels that they never had before. I was hired to be a writer at CNNpolitics.com. Remember, I had no interest in being in broadcast journalism. But people were watching CNN at times and at levels that they never had before, like at 5 a.m. And shows that came on at 5 a.m. were like, well, we need to elevate our show and get more people on. And like, Van Jones isn't going to come on at 5 a.m. And so let's get this Eugene guy. And I was like, okay. And I did it, and I loved it, and I did very well. And so soon I was on Anderson Cooper's show and Wolf Blitzer's show and Jake Tapper's show. And it was a lot of fun. But I didn't want to keep doing like direct reporting. That's not why I came to CNN. I wanted to write about policy and analysis. And I had a great opportunity from the Washington Post. They said, hey, we have an opening for The Fix, which is a political analysis blog. And we're looking for a reporter, but we want that reporter to tell us what he or she wants to do. And so that never happens. I have never heard anyone else who was able to walk into an organization and say, this is what I want to do, and I want you to pay me this. And it was incredibly competitive. They hired me. There were more than 110 people who applied. And just so it doesn't sound like everything's just worked out my way, this was the third or fourth job I applied to the Washington Post. And I'm telling you all the high points. There's so many failures. I told some students earlier, the internship I got after undergrad was the only internship I got out of 30. I was waitlisted at Columbia, which does not sound, that hard when you ended up getting into Harvard, but that's not the point. So yeah, I went to the Washington Post, and I've been there writing about identity politics for more than a year. And in my pitch, the reason I said it's important that I believe you need someone to focus on identity politics is because what the 2016 election revealed to me as someone who, has lived in the suburbs of Kansas and the downtown Phoenix and Harlem and Cape Town and DC and rural North Carolina is that various groups in this country know very little about groups outside of their groups. There are evangelicals who know zero agnostics or atheists, and vice versa. There are baby boomers who know no millennials. There are American-born Americans who have never met a refugee or an immigrant. There are, people who've been married for 50 years to their high school sweetheart who've never met a queer person. And I, fortunately, have moved in many of these circles. And if I don't know a lot about them, I know people who do know a lot about them. And so what I do professionally is I like to think that I write about groups for people outside of those groups. And so I bring in experts and data and history and context that hopefully helps us understand our world more than we did before we ran my piece. That's what I would like to think I do. I don't know if I do, but they like me. My boss told me last week that he was glad that he hired me. And so as someone who lives for affirmation of leaders, I needed that. So that's just how I got here from sitting on my mom's bed watching The Absence of Black People to crying at lectures. So just some key points before we get to the Q&A. So identity politics, as I said, to me, it's the idea that the groups that you are a part of, be it gender, faith, race, class, orientation, nationality, on and on and on, shape how you view the world and the policies that you support. We have decades of data that say that women tend to view some issues differently than men. White people view some issues differently than black people. Baby boomers see some issues differently than millennials. LGBTQ people see issues very often differently than straight people. Poor people look at issues differently than rich people. And so there seems to be this idea a lot of times that identity politics is this bad thing that separates us. Well, the reality is anyone who has studied American history knows that the identity groups that you are a part of have always shaped how you experience America. No one has experienced America equally the same way. Oh gosh, I'm crying again. I was talking to Vincent. My father's dad died this morning. And I was supposed to take my dad to see him on Thanksgiving. Scheduling didn't work out, and I didn't. I wasn't able to. But my Uncle Robert is 83 years old. Uncle Robert was born in the segregated South. He has only gone to all black schools. His parents moved to DC. He joined the Air Force, had a great career at the Pentagon. He's had a rich, full life. But my Uncle Robert, who was alive as of last night, was not able to vote freely in America until he was a grown man because he was black. And so that shapes how you view policy and how politics affect you. And that's not original. I mean, that Uncle Robert's not unique. And so I write about just how that has shaped the world and how it continues to shape people's experience in America. And I think people who understand that took that spirit with them to the polls in many ways in the 2018 election. And there are three groups that shaped the outcome of the 2018 election more than any other. Not the only groups, and I can talk about other groups, but the three that I want to talk about first are women, millennials, and swing voters. And so you may or may not have heard that in this recent midterms, the largest number of women were elected to Congress than at any other point in history. And that's in part because after the 2016 election, one of the biggest segments of the resistance, which is a loose group of Americans who are at the very least unsupportive of the Trump administration, have been women. And that has been in response to the rise of the Me Too movement, concerns about sexual assault, everywhere from the White House to our local churches and businesses, and wanted to put people in office who would work aggressively at dismantling systems that allow for sexual assault to happen without being corrected, and also wanting to see policies that they felt like were more left-leaning and liberal for women when it comes to issues related to health care and abortion rights, as well as the economy. As much as we have this White House talk about the success that is happening in the economy, and on the grand scheme of things, the economy is doing very well. The economy is doing better for some groups more than other groups. Just a quick pivot, like whenever the president is asked to give an account for comments and actions he has made that land negatively on black people, his go-to response is, we have the lowest black unemployment rate. Well, number one, black people care about more than a low unemployment rate. Number two, the black unemployment rate is still higher than the white unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate for women is still higher than the unemployment rate for men. And so a lot of women went to the polls wanting to send officers to Washington and their state governments who can improve things related to healthcare, socioeconomics, and just their respect as women and their protection in terms of related to issues connected to sexual assault and harassment. And some examples of that we saw, and this isn't just a liberal thing. Tennessee sent its first woman to the Senate, Marsha Blackburn, and she's a Republican and a strong supporter of Trump. But generally speaking, this was a phenomenon that we saw on the left. Arizona sent its first woman to the Senate. We saw, her name's Kirsten Sinema. We saw Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez come from New York. She's the youngest person to be elected to Congress. She'll be 29 when she's sworn in January. And we saw the first time election of Native American women and Muslim women. And I think that's an important point I just want to harp on a bit. I wrote an article about like the first. There were so many historic firsts. One of the things that's sad about first, like I tend to think when we hear about this person is the first person to do this, we applaud because like history was made. I generally think first in this day and age are like embarrassing. So the idea that it took to 2018 for a Native American woman to get to Congress is kind of embarrassing. To think that Tennessee has never found a woman, Arizona has never found a woman, Iowa has never found a woman that they think should be in Congress, I don't think that is that celebratory. And so I think when we find ourselves looking at these marks, it's not about look at you, person, for this accomplishment. The question should be, why did it take this long for us to believe that this person or people from this group should have had a seat at the table? But we saw some major glass ceilings break for women in this last midterm election. Millennials, which is a fascinating group that somehow I'm a part of and many of you are a part of. But millennials are this left-leaning group, generally speaking, that has some of the lowest voter turnout historically since millennials were able to vote, which varies depending on where you are on the spectrum. According to the Pew Research Center, a millennial is someone born between 1981 and 1996. And we're increasingly seeing Pew and other think tanks study the post-millennial demographic as well, because if you're born in 1997, you're 21, right? Is that right? Yeah, okay. And therefore, right? Oh my gosh, goodness. I was in high school and making decisions. But millennials voted in the 2018 midterms at significantly higher rates in 2014. There was an increase of 188%. And they overwhelmingly supported Democratic candidates. Now, some people are surprised by that. I'm not that surprised, and I'll tell you why I'm not surprised. We tend to think millennials are college sophomores trying to figure out what it is that they want to do with their life, who have these convictions, but perhaps don't always act on them. The reality is a lot of millennials are 35 years old with partners and 3 kids and houses and college debt and health issues and car notes. And people who have these descriptions are much more likely to care about policy and politics, and they vote. Like I said, I'm 37. I've been voting since 2000, 2004, 2008, 12. Oh, goodness. Yeah, it's been a long time. And so it's not a surprise to me that more millennials came out, but they did, and they supported candidates who were left-leaning more often than not. And by all accounts, their support was a referendum on Trump. And that brings me to the last group, which is a continuation of that, which is swing voters. In 2016, President Trump won swing voters. Generally speaking, swing voters are viewed 2 different ways. In theory, it's viewed as people who vote for both Democrats and Republicans consistently, depending on the election. There are not that many people like that. There are people who will tell you they're swing voters. You all probably have some parents who are like, I'm an independent, I'm a swing voter. You voted for Obama once. You usually vote for Republicans. That's not really a swing voter, right? It's someone who voted for Obama once. And that's fine for you. But we are seeing people who voted for Trump, who voted for Trump in 2016, who voted for Obama previously, who did vote Democrat again. And a lot of these people are college educated, more affluent professionals in the suburbs of major cities. And when I was on the ground in Arizona talking to some of these swing voters who voted for Kyrsten Sinema, the Democrat running for the Senate, they didn't do it because they have liberal worldviews. They did it in part because they wanted to see Congress do a better job of being a check and balance on President Trump. The way the Republican Party has moved recently is that the majority of Republicans, more than 80%, generally agree with President Trump on most things. President Trump has a higher approval rating of Republicans than any Republican president, including Ronald Reagan, in the last 40 years. And what that has meant is that many things that perhaps would not have been tolerated by Congress in the past are being looked over or given a pass. And there are a few reasons for that, which I'd be glad to speak about. And so while Republicans still hold control of the Senate for a few reasons, in part because of just how, you could argue how the Senate is set up, Democrats won the House. One could argue Democrats were already going to win the House because historically the midterms go to the party that is not in the White House. But the Democrats won the House at a level that we have not seen before. More than 1 million people, more than 1 million people voted Democrat versus Republican in terms of who got control of the House this go around. And if I'm correct, and I think I am, there's still some races that are undecided. Like they're still counting ballots in some races in California. And there was a really interesting thing. There's a debate on Twitter, which you should not get into. This guy was asking why can't California count its ballots as quickly as Virginia? And the obvious answer, besides some logistical questions that can probably be solved, is there are a lot more people in California than Virginia. But I didn't want to wade in because I wanted to focus on my speech for tonight. And so it's been a long day. I was on Morning Joe on MSNBC at 5 a.m. this morning and 6 a.m. So I'm glad I'm even here. And so swing voters, for the most part, decided that they wanted to see Congress not move in a radically left direction, but they just didn't want their lawmakers constantly signing off on whatever it is President Trump did. And so swing voters, women, and millennials. And so it'll be, it'll be interesting when the new Congress is sworn in January to see what our next government looks like, because many of the demographic groups that got out and backed the lawmakers that were able to win their races are going to have demands and desires and want to see their government reflect the issues and the concerns that they, supported when these candidates were campaigning. And it'll be fascinating also to see what happens in 2020 and how Trump and his Congress and the branches, judicial branches, respond to what has very much been a referendum on his presidency. By all accounts, it has been a blue wave. When you look at the initiatives that passed, like in Florida in 2020, convicted felons who've been released will now be able to vote. Lots of left-leaning ideas like that were supported. House obviously went left. We saw a lot of judges that were left-leaning get elected. That was a really fascinating thing. So you had some big races like the Texas Senate race between Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke. While the Democrat lost, like the number of the down ballots were incredibly successful. There were Democratic Congress people who got elected, Democratic judges got elected, state legislatures turned more blue. Even though the big race didn't come, wasn't a victory for the left. We also saw that in Mississippi. It'll be interesting to see what is going to happen in state governments, in part because state government is where we're impacted in our lives. Mostly city councils affect our lives day to day more than our presidential races, which is why it's really important to vote in midterms. And so I think right now everybody's at a wait and see, because there was a blue wave. Was the blue wave as big as people thought it would be? That's debate. But in closing, what there really wasn't was a red wave. And Trump said there would be. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2020. So that's just a really brief synopsis of what happened. You could argue a couple weeks ago, or you could say it's still happening since votes are still being counted. But I'd be willing to answer anything about that or anything more broadly. I hope that was somewhat helpful or informative. If you've been watching TV news every day and reading, which I hope you don't, because that's nothing you should do unless you're paid to do it. You probably know all of this, but I hope some of it was informative to you. So, hey.
So about the,
Thanks.
the identity politics question. There's a New York Times article that kind of played a role in the Mark Villa article about identity politics.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious, when that was happening, he's obviously talking about identity politics in a way different than what
Sure.
you're talking about. Yeah. So how do you try to help people navigate the important dimension that you're talking about without getting caught up in the way that people were sort of either very supportive of what Lola said or very reactionary?
Yeah, so for those not familiar with the argument, the main pushback from identity politics is honestly coming from conservatives, because the idea is that we're not Black Americans and white Americans and Christian Americans and Muslim Americans. We're just Americans. And that's actually just not true, supported by the data. Like, the reality is your identities determine how differently you experience America. The reality is, if you talk to a Muslim American in South Carolina, they probably very often have a very different experience than a conservative Christian in South Carolina. And Nikki Haley has some great stories about that. She's not a Muslim American, she's a Christian American, but her family, I believe, is Sikh. Don't quote me on that, but she definitely has stories about experiencing discrimination as a child. And there are people, the idea is that identity politics is divisive. And I have a couple thoughts about that. I don't think division and difference are inherently wrong. I think it's okay that I am not you and you are not me. And I think that is not a new or well-received idea to people who believe that sameness is what's best. But I think what's also true, I mean, if people are deeply invested in just dismissing an idea, there's nothing you can really do to change their mind. I think we talked about this Upton Sinclair quote that said it's hard to make someone believe something when their salary depends on them not believing it. I just tell them, if we really desire to make this country a more equal place for everyone in it, we have to talk about how inequality exists. And the best way to do that is to explore it and figure out why it exists and what can be done to narrow those gaps. But at the end of the day, if you look at who votes and how they vote, people on the right who criticize identity politics will admit that, look, we can't deny that we're killing the rural vote. We're killing it with the white vote. We're killing it with the older senior vote. We're killing it with the uneducated vote. We're killing it with the very Christian vote. And there's a reason for that. And we should figure that out. And so I don't push back on the idea as much as present the data. So, hey.
Yeah, you had mentioned that Republicans have been kind of looking over different issues regarding Trump. Could you expand on that?
Looking over? I think it was said in the context that Republicans in Congress generally support Trump. And so a perfect example is, should have a perfect example in mind before you say a perfect example is. But a perfect example of how that has changed since the midterms is Jamal Khashoggi is a journalist at the Washington Post who was killed by the Saudi Arabian government or those closely working with them. It has pretty much wrecked our newsroom, as you can imagine. Trump has not taken a hard line on holding the Saudi Arabian government accountable for what U.S. intelligence agencies say happened. And senators, the Republicans are still in control of the Senate, have really pushed back on Trump in terms of saying, we want to hear from the CIA, we want to be presented with information, and we will not vote on almost anything, including spending bills, until you give us more information. Because multiple officials from the Trump White House have gone to the Senate to present to them the information that they have about this death, but have not allowed the CIA to present information that they have. And Lindsey Graham was actually on MSNBC this morning and said, I have a top security clearance, yet I'm learning more information about this from MSNBC and the Washington Post than I am from the US government, and that's a problem. And so until the Trump White House gives me more information, I'm not going to vote in a way that is consistent with what the president wants. I don't know that that would have happened if the Republicans would have won the House and had things go their way. And I think what Republican lawmakers understand is that, and many of them who barely won their races, realize that voters are saying we don't want people who are yes people to the president. If you look at the most recent Quinnipiac poll, university poll, which is a very reliable poll, almost everything Trump does, Republicans approve of highly. 80% of Republicans approve of how Trump handled this Saudi Arabian situation. 80% of Republicans approve how Trump has handled the Mueller investigation and the relationship with Russia. 80% of Republicans approve of how Trump has handled race relations. And I think we are seeing a bit of a pivot there because the electorate is not with Trump at 80%. Trump's approval rating overall is less than 40%. And it gets even lower when you control it for other groups like Black Americans or millennials. And so I'm trying to think of an example of, well, no, I think I gave you some examples of where they approve very highly and how that perhaps is changing now. So.
What role did you see evangelicals play in this election, and did their support of Republican candidates wane whatsoever in comparison to the 2016 election?
So yes. So it's important when we talk about evangelicals that we distinguish between white evangelicals and evangelicals of color. I don't think the media does a great job of that. Evangelicals of color are overwhelmingly unsupportive of Trump and the Republican Party as a whole, and there are lots of reasons for that, which we can unpack. Republicans still won the white evangelical vote, which should not be surprising. That's probably going to be that way for a while. But not at the same percentages that they did in 2016, depending on when you control for certain states. A sizable percentage of white evangelical women have voted against the Republican Party for two reasons in particular. One, the Me Too movement. And if you've been reading even, Christian media, Christianity Today has covered it, other organizations have covered it. There have been conversations about the Me Too movement and sexual harassment and sexual assault within the church and within Christian communities. And a lot of white evangelical women have seen their pastors and their leaders not address this in a way that they would have wanted, and have, really had to deal with the trauma of this in ways that have been very harmful. In Texas and along the border, we've seen a lot of white evangelical women who are a little more hands-on with immigration issues not respond well to seeing babies locked in cages. There were examples, there are real actual stories of undocumented immigrant women nursing their kids and agents coming and removing nursing babies from their mothers. More than 140 of these children have still not been returned. More than $80 million has been spent housing and trying to figure out what to do with these kids until they get reunited. Large percentages of these kids have not been in school a day since they have arrived here. And quite a few of them have not had records kept with them and therefore will probably never be returned to their birth parents. And so a lot of really conservative Christian women have said, I'm sorry, I just recognized you were there, so I know it's embarrassing for you. So I was wondering if you were coming. So a lot of their parents, a lot of white evangelical women have been like, if this lawmaker thinks that this is okay, that this is going to continue, then I don't want them in office. And the New York Times had a great piece about that. And I think many of you all have been involved in these conversations about how pro-life has to be about more than abortion. And I think we've seen that. But that's been one of the big shifts we saw in the 2018 election, then we saw in the 2016 in terms of evangelical voters. Evangelical people of color have consistently voted against Trump and the Republicans, and that's probably just going to continue.
Is what you're just saying about the border experiences, is that a way to lessen identity politics and the tribal perspective of almost not understanding other people, not being aware of what's happening, but being single-minded?
Lessen? When you say lessen, what do you mean?
Probably the understanding of other people. Not
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, I think one of the interesting things about identity is that we all have multiple identities, right? And so I think there are people who may have seen the undocumented immigrants as just undocumented immigrants, and I'm an American. But this story has been like, oh, she's actually a mom too, and I'm a mom. And I can connect with her on that. And so or she's a young single mom, or a mom of a child with disabilities. And I think that has kind of helped people connect, because ultimately, I mean, if you want to talk about my bias or agenda, I think ultimately what I would like people to understand is that, like, at the end of the day, we're all image bearers. And so when you see people primarily as different from me and other, opposed to a human being created in the same image that I was, you should process things differently. That doesn't mean you always arrive at a different conclusion, but how you go into treating them doesn't start from difference. But yeah, I think we've seen people look at that issue in particular. I mean, Trump has overwhelmingly been, Americans have not liked the fact that that is how children and minors have been treated in coming to the States, except for, quite frankly, Republicans overwhelmingly approve of it. So.
What's the future of identity politics in the United States? I echo like your kind of sentiment of it has a role, right, in formulating opinion. However, we're kind of seeing trends of just increasing polarization of Democrats and Republicans viewing each other unfavorably, and almost to the point where it's almost vitriolic at this point. But it's just ironic, given that we're in a pretty economically stable, and I echo your sentiment of not everyone is benefiting from this economy as they should be, and there's clearly injustices that are occurring every day and tragedies at the border or in cities. But I mean, what happens when the economy goes to crap? You know?
Yeah, different communities are handling it differently. There are places that are becoming perhaps more polarized, and there are reasons for that. But there are also places that are really fed up with the division and are seeing division in ways that can be fixed, and are trying to work on solving problems. So the new freshman class of at least Democratic lawmakers are more progressive than moderate, but have said, look, we're here to work with the moderates. Like the new chair of the Democratic House caucus named Hakeem Jeffries, he's a New York congressman. He comes from corporate America, worked as a corporate attorney for CBS, and therefore it's not like as progressive as some of the other lawmakers who ran against him. But excuse me, but he wants to work with them to figure out how can solutions be reached across the aisles within even subgroups. I mean, you talk about polarization, there's like polarization within even like the GOP, right? You have Mike Lee in Utah versus like, who's very conservative and pro-Trump, versus like Jeff Flake in Arizona, who obviously is not. And so I think there are still people who are saying, okay, we have to work together. I don't know that many people in top positions of leadership who just are coming to Congress who are not trying to work together, because they realize that like this is not going to like improve. It's just going to get worse, and that doesn't help anyone at the end of the day. But I think some people would argue that the working together could mean like ignoring or forgetting our differences and like downplaying them. And I don't think that's the direction that people want to go in. I think the direction that people want to go in is saying, okay, how can we be united despite our differences? And how can we make things better for as many people as possible?
There's another question right now.
Sure, yeah.
You talked how in your new position, you're writing analysis and perhaps being to make policy recommendations. I would just love to hear from a personal level, like a policy issue recommendation you enjoy writing about or hope to write about soon.
So I can tell you a policy issue I like writing about. I'm not supposed to make recommendations. I sometimes accidentally do, and my editor reminds me that that's not my job. Like, I've ended pieces at times like what should happen or something. Just like that's not what I do. But it's hard to like, not say this is what I think should happen. A policy issue that I care about quite a bit. I'm very interested in education policy and school desegregation. You may know that some schools are more segregated today than they were when my dad was in school. My dad went to segregated schools. Yeah, I mean, there's so many studies that suggest that like the education you're receiving at like 3rd grade shapes so much. And if so many of the problems we have related to poverty and unemployment and criminal justice with adults like can start at the elementary school level. And so it would be interesting to see what role funding and businesses and nonprofits can play in trying to help eliminate that injustice and that gap as early as possible, because you can therefore solve problems that'll just surface later on. It's interesting, I'm not a parent, and I'm not here to tell parents what they should do. I know it's a very hard conversation in terms of when you're trying to figure out what's the best education situation for your kids, because I have siblings and nieces and nephews, and I've watched the process happening. But I think people are realizing more and more that as much as I need to be involved and concerned about the well-being of my kids' education, I should probably care about like how the kids over there are being educated as well, because if I don't care, I'm going to have to care eventually. I mean, if you've ever spent any time doing prison ministry or just even looking at documentaries, like some of the narratives of inmates are like so unoriginal. It's like, how did you get here? Well, single parent wasn't either educated themselves, not a strong emphasis on education for me, no mentorship, no investment from businesses in my public school. It was a low performing public school. And you look at people who are doing very well, and you're like, how did you get here? Well, I usually went to good schools, and I usually was in after school programs. I usually have mentors, and so some of these problems can be fixed, and I'm very interested in seeing what foundations are doing to try to fix some of those. So, yeah.
Related to the question of looking down the road, so specifically 2 years down the road, what are your predictions for 2020? Do you see the same things happening in the midterm elections that's going to get bigger scale, millennials, women, swing voters?
I think a lot is depending on these investigations, what comes from them. And I don't just mean the Russia investigation. If you read the news today, you know that Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, admitted that while the election was happening, he was involved in conversations with Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, about Trump Tower in Moscow. We know that Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, according to the special counsel, has been found to be lying and dishonest with the special counsel in terms of what he did and did not know. And so I think a lot will happen depending on what's happening. I think it's also, I mean, anything could happen. Like for some reason, Trump could decide he may not want to run again. Mike Pence may run. Someone may primary Trump. There are like 1 million Democrats who want to run. And that depends, that shapes so many. Who will the party get behind? If Trump's able to do some bipartisan work, he has suggested that he really does want to work more with Democrats than, he suggests he does at his rallies. And yeah, I don't have any predictions. I will say that journalists and analysts did a much better job of predicting 2018 than 2016. And they didn't do as bad at predicting 2016 as their critics believe. And I certainly could talk about that and why that is the case. But I've learned to, I think one of the things it's been very difficult and interesting in the last 2 years is learning that America is a very different place than I thought it was. And that's not been exciting sometimes, especially for someone who, it's like, I kind of get America. I've been to a few places. But I don't know. I think we all, and some of us more than others, have studied with people and worshiped with people and worked with people and lived near people who saw issues very differently than we did. And we were surprised by that. And it will be interesting to see how differently or similarly they see issues in 2020. So, yeah.
So, given your interest in identity politics, what do you make of Kanye's relationship with Trump?
So I've written way more about Kanye than someone who has not had a Kanye album in like 3 albums should have. I was in Milan for my birthday, and wrote a Kanye story because I have terrible work-life balance. Like that literally is why. That like I could have been touring Milan and I'm in a hotel room writing about Kanye West. Well, I mean, we know that the relationship is non-existent now. I mean, Kanye has come out and said that he feels like he was being used by primarily black conservatives, but the White House as a whole to kind of, it's like a minority outreach approach, which was like incredibly ineffective because despite what some people may think, like black people don't look to rappers to decide how they want to vote. And with all due respect to the president, that could be a surprise to him because the president is very enamored by celebrities. And he will admit that. Celebrities mean a lot to him. But like when I'm thinking about like, you know, urban policy and law enforcement, I'm not thinking about what Kanye's thinking about. And Kanye feels misrepresented. I think it did a disservice kind of to his brand, and he's been trying to redeem it. Like in the last month or so, he's given to like liberal candidates. Has been working on criminal justice reform, and I can't remember what he did with Obama, but he did something very positive. I don't know if he gave to the foundation, but it was an interesting moment for media as a business because it was very entertaining to some people, but it's sad because I mean we're talking about policy. This isn't like really like supposed to be about entertainment, but you know articles did really well online. People spend a lot of time on TV, you know, providing analysis. I don't know that it was the best use of anyone's time though. Yeah.
I mean, on the media track there, I think. Do you think that that's possibly because most Americans construct their understanding of other people's identities through media? It's mostly a mediated understanding of other people rather than living in very different places in the United States or meeting somebody who's completely outside my group. I do it through media, and by and large, that like most people are constructing. And so like, you know, somebody might think about black people mostly through what they know of Kanye West or the Donald Trump's, to me at least maybe, his enamorment with celebrities is normative more than it is exceptional.
I do agree with you. If your main exposure to a community is through the media, you will more often than not say, I believe this presentation is true because you don't have anything to say, oh, that's actually not true. I used to live in Kansas, and I know that this is not how things work in Kansas. Like if someone, you know, if a sitcom says this is what, you know, this experience is like, we're much more likely to just take it as it is. I think President Trump's affection for celebrities is very normative for an American. I don't think it's normative for like a president of the country, right? I think most people would be very excited if, you know, a hip hop artist tweeted us or wanted to come see us at our house. I don't think most presidents would say, while you are here, Kim Kardashian, let's talk about criminal justice reform. I think most presidents would say, I have access to people who have PhDs in this area and who've worked in this space for 20-something years. I should probably talk to them. But to her credit, when she was there advocating for the release of a grandmother who was given a life sentence for a relatively minor drug offense. She was able to convince Trump to pardon her, and that's really awesome. And so it'll be interesting to see if this will lead to a complete reform of how our criminal justice laws look. And there's been some conversation about that. There's a bill right now that the Senate is looking at trying to reevaluate mandatory minimums because I think both sides of the aisle, and we saw this in 2016, because I was covering Rand Paul, and that went really well. Most Americans have concluded that the best way to respond to people who commit crime is not to lock them up forever. It's incredibly expensive. It destroys families. It's terrible for mental health. It's unredemptive. We can just go on and on and on. So I think people are re-examining that. Hey.
I kind of have a double question.
Sure.
One is just, do you have any stories or thoughts on transformation of people and having seen people learn to see the world through a lens that's outside of their identity?
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of along with that, a more personal question of like, at the Thanksgiving dinner table or like wherever, when you run into someone who has an extremely offensive comment based on their identity politics,
Yeah.
do you have any like, I don't know, what do you do in that?
Yeah. I see more transformation from like individuals than politicians. Politicians have like donors and people that it makes it difficult for them to walk back things. But yeah, I mean, I do life with people. I have friends and family who, this may be a controversial thing to say here, but I might as well. In 30 states in the United States, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against LGBT people. There are no legal protections for queer people in 30 states in the United States. What that looks like is that if you were in a restaurant in Arizona, not Phoenix, but like in Chandler, Arizona, and two guys were sitting down and a owner said, "We don't serve gay people here," the owner could kick these people out and they would have no legal protections. Most people, even conservative people, conservative Christians, when they hear that, they're like, that sounds wrong. And so we've seen people, generally speaking, not support, discrimination. There are people in Congress today, there are people alive today who were very supportive of schools being segregated and spaces being segregated. Like, the 60s were not that long ago. And so I see transformation in those stories quite a bit. I laugh at the Thanksgiving. Oh, okay. So I think while I'm there on a policy level, John McCain, who just recently died, who I got to cover in Arizona, has said that one of his big regrets was voting against the Martin Luther King Day holiday. So that's a transformation thing, and that's a legacy that he that really shaped his legacy with people of color, as you can imagine. I laugh at the Thanksgiving question because there are all these articles that come out right before Thanksgiving, like how do you talk to your crazy uncle, and it's funny watching Black people respond to these tweets because Black people were like, everybody on my family was on the same page, and it's like not everybody has a crazy racist uncle, and I don't have a lot of experience talking to relatives who disagree with me on issues, but I do have a lot on big issues, but definitely on little issues related to immigration. And when I say big issues, I mean like no one in my family thinks it's appropriate to call an NFL player kneeling against racism a son of a B, which our president does. But I think I think what I've been able to do is just ask questions mainly and try to understand what it is that is causing the anxiety. So there was a great study done by The Atlantic, and I think it's the initials are PPRI, and one of the P's is public, and the Research Institute, I don't know the other P. Yes, so PRRI, not PP. That's good, because I was like, what's the other P? Public Religion Research Institute. And they asked a lot of Trump supporters in 2016 why they voted for Trump, and cultural anxiety was one of the main reasons. And what that means is their idea of what America should be was changing. America was becoming more diverse ethnically, religiously, in terms of sexual orientation. And what I have found, because I really do like to, I don't find preaching, I know I'm not supposed to say that here, but I don't always find preaching to be the most effective way at changing people's opinions as much as just listening and just helping them process why they think what they think, because a lot of times they don't know why they think what they think and haven't thought about what they're thinking about. And so if you just ask questions and get to the root of it, I think it's better. I think a better use of our time, I have found, it's not trying to change people's minds, but like understand why they feel the way they do. And what usually is revealed is a lot of times they don't even really know why they feel the way they do. But people are, I think one of the things that shocked me most about the cultural anxiety is just how afraid so many people are of like everything. I'm like in Vacation Bible School, you learn God is not giving us a spirit of fear, but like everybody's just walking around just afraid of what's going to happen. Afraid of what? Like, yeah, and it's just really telling what people think the world should be and what they fear it can become if it changes. Yeah.
I guess I'm curious to hear a little bit then of how, because what I'm hearing from you right now is this sort of mentality that like how we understand people, how we make sense of how to change opinions is by getting to know where you come from, where is your foundation, where you're afraid of, kind of some of that emotional, what's pulling you towards this particular opinion. But when I think about the kind of the broader national political discourse in mainstream media as a whole is very, let's talk about these big stories as opposed to talking about the small picture stories of like, how is this affecting this one individual person or these individual people? So I guess my question is, there's an assumption in there that kind of answers my own question. I'd love to hear your opinion of just how you would like to see national political discourse change to better reflect that sort of, let's take each other's perspectives as a way to be.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage more consumption of print media than TV media. I think the way you learn about your neighbor is by reading long stories about them in your local newspaper or national newspapers. I don't think you go to Fox News and CNN and MSNBC to learn individual stories. That's not what is set up. But, you know, I think once you hear someone's story, their narrative, you realize they're human and you see some parallels to some things that interest you. And that hopefully can kind of shape just your perspective maybe. I just think I just believe in the power of relationship and connecting with human beings. It's not always 100% effective. I think it's more effective, though, than talking about big ideas that you can't put a face on, because so often the big ideas are exaggerated and we're making caricatures of people, right? And so, like, even, you know, you can even be like your crazy racist uncle or whatever. And sometimes when you unpack things, it's like, this is also someone who has had a job in a factory for a very long time and has watched other factories close and realizes that things are moving incredibly more technologically, and like his uncle's nervous because he does not know whether or not he's going to be able to adjust to the new skills, and very well probably will not, and wants to know what that means for his livelihood. I was reading an article today. The CDC came out with a report. The life expectancy has dropped a bit, and it's terrible in rural areas. And as someone who's mostly lived in urban spaces, and I've like done life in like rural places because of relatives, but I've never like really lived in a rural place. And so I may know more about rural America than the average person who lives in DC, but still not a lot. Anyway, the point is the suicide rate among rural Americans is double that of urban Americans. And it's really high with men. And it's really high with white baby boomer men. And you see that and you're like kind of surprised, but like I don't know what it's like to grow up and feel the hopelessness, like looking around and seeing no options and no, you know what I mean? And so a good way to do that is to like reading stories about, I mean, there was this, gosh, I can't remember, I wish I could remember, but there was this great story about this chicken factory in rural Alabama. Yeah, I don't know, was that NPR or something? Okay, yeah. Yes, I was like, I remember reading it, but I can't remember what outlet because I didn't read it. Yeah, but that's a great example because I don't know what it's like to work at a chicken factory in rural Alabama, right? And it was fascinating. I think one of the women they profiled like didn't even finish like high school. And I'm very amazed by the number of people walking around America who don't have a high school diploma. I don't know how they are making it. And they're afraid because I know how many college grads are afraid to get a job, right? I mean, not the wrong place to say this probably, but you're going to be okay. Yeah, so I say that I say consume media that centers people opposed to like vague ideas. Yeah, NPR is awesome. Yeah.
My dad is English, and my English family was visiting this summer for my sister's wedding, and one day they talked to us and they were like, we were super confused because we turned on the news this morning and they were just like talking about what they thought about things, and it wasn't like reporting, and that would not be how it goes in England. How do you think like that kind of different format maybe influences our political conversations?
Yeah, I mean, so depending on what show they were watching and network, some of the people are talking about things because they have reported on it, which is me this morning, or because they have experience and expertise in the area that they are discussing. And I'm sure it can look like at times that this person is just saying what they want because they feel like it, but that person usually has a background in the area that they're talking about and still works in that area that gives them some expertise that's led to their invitation to the table. That's on some of the best shows. That's not every show. I don't know why Tommy Lauren is on TV talking about things. I don't know why, some people get invited to talk about things, but I think it's fine to have people with experience and expertise talking about what they're talking about. But that doesn't always happen. And when that does happen, it's not helpful. Like, generally speaking, people shouldn't talk about things they don't know about. And MSNBC got in trouble last week, got a lot of criticism because they were having this climate change conversation, and there was a fellow from the American Enterprise Institute, which I respect greatly. They've had me come speak. I hope they bring me back. There was a woman who said, look, I'm not a scientist, and I don't know a lot about climate change, but this is what I think. And like, full stop, she was saying all this stuff that like people in the science industry was like, why is she even on there? And I don't think that's helpful.
So I was thinking about the Imago Dei as being a real kind of way for people to overcome differences, but then as the church being more and more relegated to an interest group and kind of how we push ourselves to that label. What do you think the role of the gospel is in the space of identity politics?
Well, I mean, I think the way the gospel at best is designed is communicating, or at least communicated, is that our primary identity is in Christ, right? But that's not our only identity. And I think one place some anti-identity politics, Christians perhaps, have gotten things wrong is saying, we're not black and we're not dads and we're just followers of Christ. And no, we're multiple things. And I think that affects how we view the world and how we should treat other people as well. But I mean, quite frankly, I think what I've learned as a journalist, and in the last 2 years covering the world as we know it, is just how much we have failed to master the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. I think about how much time, we've spent like trying to master like Reformed theology and just read Kuyper. And I'm like, you probably should not like curse at your neighbor. Like let's start there. Let's really get these fundamental simple truths, because like no one is that interested in the nuance of your understanding to me that while I thought that was written in the Greek, it was actually written in the Aramaic. If you are just a jerk, and that's not me being like trying to be tongue in cheek. Like I'm looking at people talking to people not like themselves. I'm like, you are really mean and unhelpful. And no one really cares about the nuance of what you're talking about. It's disrespectful, given how disrespectful you're being. And so I think what's been fascinating to me is just how many of the big ideas we're missing. You hear like, it sounds so cliche, everything you need to know you learn in kindergarten. But it's kind of true. Like I feel like there's sometimes I write about people who failed Sunday school, and like I know you don't even get grades, but if you did, they would have failed. And I'm not perfect or above it. At my worst, I've been in my online like conversations and forgotten that I'm talking to human beings. But I think that is perhaps at this point some of the things that we can prioritize, those people who believe that the gospel is the most important message possible, more than any other news that can be delivered.
Moving a little bit away from the political side, first of all, thank you for sharing the stories and how it impacts you emotionally. And,
That was not the plan.
Yeah. So I'm interested. So when I hear about your story, I'm really interested about the issue of faith and work and life transition, like moving from country to other countries, visiting Africa, moving to Kansas, and finally, leaving your job in Phoenix to go back to grad school. And how do you navigate through that, those life transitions, and how does your faith impact your decision?
How have I navigated them?
Yeah.
Yeah, some very well, some very poorly. I was talking to student journalists today. They were like, what are some other jobs I would like to do at the Washington Post or in general besides mine? And a dream job that I'm not sure I'll ever have, because I'm 37 and I see the world differently now, is I love the idea of being a foreign correspondent. And I have friends who are foreign correspondents, and having worked internationally, it was really great. People matter a lot more to me than they did when I was younger, and I'm not saying that people don't matter to foreign correspondents, but I just want to see the people I love a little more than foreign correspondents do. Yeah. So I think relationships matter a lot more than success, and relationships have always mattered to me, but they just matter a whole lot more now. And so, whereas in the past I would have been quick to like jump from city or organization for the best job possible, I'm just not going to do that at this point in my life. And no judgment to those who do, but like I don't want it to be like a big deal to be able to see my family as it has been in the past. Finding what has been very difficult, which I have not shared a lot. So I grew up in the predominantly black church. I'm named after a pastor. My grandfather, my little brother is a minister in Nashville. But most of my adult life has been in predominantly white evangelical churches, in part because there are not a lot of black people in Arizona, 3% actually, or in Kansas, or more in North Carolina, but still not as many as people probably would think. And so in Phoenix, I had an incredibly supportive church community that loved me through some very huge personal crises, helped support me going to school, Vance likes, and I mean, like really, like helped pay college tuition for me, and just loved me and cared for me. What was very hard, so I left Phoenix in July 2014. In August 2014, Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri by a police officer. And I watched many people who I felt like loved and supported me respond very negatively to the issue of police violence in Black communities. And that was the first time I began to see that these people who said they loved me may not love me as much as they thought. And that has continued throughout this election. And so I've just seen many Christians defend the indefensible when it comes to attacks on the media, attacks on people of color, attacks on people that I don't believe Jesus would attack. And so what's been hard for me personally and many of my friends, I've seen a lot of people in the last couple of years disconnect from the church and learn. I know it's very hard to imagine this, but for many people, when many people think of white evangelicals, they think of Trump. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. And it's just not been the easiest place for me. And I don't say this because I'm anti-Trump or I hate Trump. That's not a reality. I'm saying that I've just watched people be physically attacked, journalists be physically attacked. I've watched activists who've wanted to advocate for the lives of Black people physically assaulted by people who say that Jesus is the only way. And it's the space that I have once felt so safe in, I don't feel as safe in anymore. And so I'm in a place right now where I'm trying to figure out if the people who said they love me and love Christ actually do. And many of them do. In Phoenix, I spent a lot of time with the pastor of the church that I went to there and his family. They've been awesome. I've got a lot of great people in my life who have been my community as I've moved around. But there are a lot of people who I'm just not sure that what we had was what we had anymore based on what they defend. When you see someone running for the Senate in Mississippi and they seem to celebrate the Confederacy and lynching and the suppression of Black votes, as we just had with Cindy Hyde-Smith, and that person still won the white evangelical vote, that doesn't make me want to run to your church. It makes me want to run away from your church. And so that's been difficult. But it's not the end of the world. It's definitely made me think about things. But I think not just personally. I think white evangelicalism is having a huge identity crisis right now, trying to figure out what it is really about. Is it a political group primarily, the interest group, or is it a group of people who believe that Jesus is Lord and that other people need to know? But yeah, I probably won't move around as much. My dad's old. I have a lot of nieces. I've missed a lot of birthdays. I've won a lot of awards and had a lot of success. But I'm not saying that none of that matters anymore. I still want to come to colleges and speak to people. But I don't want to miss like big events for it as much. So that's probably how I see things differently now. But I guess that could change. So, yeah.
We have a final question, okay?
Many of your stories and even your emotion give possibly even a sense of despair for our country, which I think is a very realistic way to think and feel right at this moment. And I'm wondering, maybe this is a good thing to end on.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you have any
advice or, I don't know, encouragement?
Yeah.
How do you not despair? How do you be hopeful in this moment? Because I think God calls us to hope.
Yeah.
And God calls us to community, and He calls us to be one, especially among His followers. And right now, there is much division among His followers. So
Right.
what advice do you have us for hope and moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think no, that's a great question to end on. I was telling a friend, like, one of the reasons I can't make generalizations about some of the groups that a lot of people generalize about is because I have personal relationships with people in those spaces that are doing the exact opposite. So, like, I know of church communities that are helping settle refugees and that are finding safe places for young moms trying to flee the domestic violence in Honduras and Guatemala. I know people who do believe that the lives of people not like themselves really do matter. I know that there are people working on policy issues that are really thinking deeply about how can this benefit as many people as possible while harming as few people as possible. I don't look at the TV shows where people yell at each other. I do life with people who talk to each other. The division is not my norm. Like my norm is people who are trying to say, this sucks and we got to fix this. And so I'm not. If I were pessimistic about the direction of the country, like, I wouldn't do what I do. I write because I believe that there are people who want to understand so they can make better decisions and not make as many poor decisions as we did in the past. The hard part is when, it's always hard. I mean, we know this on a policy level, or you know this like in third grade. It's just hard when you thought someone was your friend and you find out that they're not, or they're not as much of your friend as you thought they were. But then you realize that this person over here is actually really your friend that you probably didn't think was, and that's a pleasurable discovery. So I just know a lot of people who are really trying to, make things better. And I think, I meet people who are like really depressed and down and are like the world's just, things are getting worse. And I would ask those people to reevaluate the spaces in which they're doing life and what they're consuming, because there really are a lot of people getting up every day trying to honor God with their lives, and those stories aren't as sexy and don't get the ratings that they should. But and I don't even work at CNN, so I shouldn't be plugging this. But one of my favorite shows is so cheesy and it's a big weep fest. Is CNN Heroes, which comes on in December. And it just shows you like real people like from like Idaho trying to help refugees get settled, or like people with disabilities find work. And yeah, I mean, those are the stories I find myself having to consume. I'll say this, and before I close, when I was in, like I said, I don't have TV, so when I, go to these hotels and there's a TV and like 100 channels, I'm like really excited, because I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff to look at. And then you click around and you're like, this is why I don't have TV. There's not that much stuff to look at. And I was looking at one of these like, crime channels, and I was watching a documentary about Jim Jones, which is very sad. And then afterwards, it was a documentary about like spouses who like killed their husbands or something. I was like, people pay to look at this? Like, I'm not gonna look at cable news all day and come home and look at this as well. And so I would challenge people to like really consider what you're consuming, because that will shape everything. So like I remember hearing, this is like years ago in the Purpose Living Life days, when most of you are like 3, I guess. And Rick Warren said, the battle between your spirit and your flesh will be won by the one you feed the most. And so if you're just looking at and listening to these things that leave you hopeless, you're going to be. So that's where I am. So I'm glad y'all let me come out this Thursday. So, yeah.